Yeah, it's there. Fine.
Yeah, okay,
Okay.
great.
Uh, a very warm welcome to every one of you. Thank you for sustaining yourself throughout the day and for attending all our sessions. This is the last paper presentation, and I hope not the last, but for this conference and for the day. So the title of this session is Transformation and Beyond, Folklore Today. And the chair for this session is Ms. Mekhila Chattopadhyay. I would like to formally introduce her. I hope she's there with us.
Yes, Bhumika, I'm here.
Yeah, hello, ma'am. So I would like to say a few words about her. Uh, Ms. Meekla is currently working as an assistant professor at Government Kapsia PG College, Jagdalpur, Bastar, Chhattisgarh. Her ongoing doctoral work is on folk songs of Bengal. She takes a special interest in various kinds of performance cultures of India and is currently working on some folk tales of the Bastar region. Her major interests lie in the field of digital humanities, cultural studies, folkloristics, ethnomusicology, memory studies, and plant humanities. She is also the co-editor of poetry of the magazine Shuri. We welcome you, ma'am. Now I would formally hand over the session to her, and we can go
Thank you
forward.
so much, Bhumika. Thank you for introducing me. Uh, I would not waste so much of time and let the presenters present their papers. So the first presentation is by Sorinchon Rimai. Please correct me if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Um, to give his presentation, he is a PhD research scholar from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad, and the title of his paper is Beyond Literal Meaning, Indirect Speech Acts in Northeast India Folklore. Sorinjan, are you there?
Yes. Can you
Yeah,
hear me? Yeah.
yes. Please continue.
Okay. Thank you and good evening. Uh, I when I read that Mekla was presenting, I did not know who she was, but now that I see her face, she is my senior actually in IFLU. So thank you, and thank you for the organizers who for giving me a chance and for selecting my abstract. Uh, I will directly go to my presentation. Um, yeah, can you all see this?
Yeah, we can see your
Yes.
screen.
So my paper is focused on the use of language in folk narrative, which is also my own doctoral research at the moment, and it is within the realm of social linguistics and particularly in pragmatics, of which speech act theory is a part of. Now, keeping in mind the time constraints of this seminar and this presentation, I'll be very brief. I will not delve deep into the introductions, but I hope that I achieve what I set out to do here. Uh, so firstly, what is Speech Act? Very briefly, Speech Acts was formulated by J.L. Austin, who was a British philosopher, and how his work came to be in his very short career. He gave a series of lectures in Oxford, and it culminated into the book How to Do Things with Word that was published posthumously. Now, it is a reaction to the claim of the logical positivists at that time, who argued that a sentence is reducible to its verifiability, that is, whether an utterance can be verified to be true or false. But Austin contended that most of our utterance do more than make statements. When we ask questions or make order, we do not state something. When we declare something, the declaration does not allow itself to be analyzed, right, in terms of its possibility, whether it's true or false. And also language is a tool of performance in ordinary verbal utterances that we do on a daily basis. Um, Now, Austin's speech act theory is satisfied by these three components here: the illocutionary act, which is the act of speaking; the illocutionary, which is the purpose of of speaking, and the perlocutionary act, which is the effect of speaking. Now, okay, these are the basic tenets that he had given in his work. Okay, uh, now John Searle was his student back in Oxford, and he furthered this theory by expanding on the elocutionary act, which is the purpose of of speech. He expanded the elocutionary into assertives. When you assert something, when you describe or you make claims or you give information. Directive, when you give orders, you make requests. Commissive, when committing the speaker to a certain course of action, like making promise, or making offers, etc. Expressive, which is expressing the speaker's feelings, emotions, when you like apologizing, congratulating, etc. Declarative, when you declare something and you change the state of the external world, like when you name somebody, you change the world of that person. For example, when you declare someone married. Secondly, the perlocutionary act, beyond Austin's context. It encompasses how the listener interprets, understands, or reacts to the speech act based on factors like the listener's beliefs, emotions, and intentions. Felicity conditions. Certain conditions must be met for a speech act to be successful. For example, when a speaker makes a promise, they must have the intention of fulfilling the promise and the listener believing that promise. The locationary, which is the surface structure of utterances like words, phrases, and sentences to convey meaning. And lastly, the indirect speech acts. Now, these occur when the intended elocutionary force is different from the literal meaning. A speaker conveys a certain meaning indirectly, relying on the listener's ability to infer the intended speech act. Now, this is the theory that the methodology that I'll be using for this paper. Very quickly, indirect speech act defined by Searle is when is defined as utterance in which one elocutionary act, which is the primary act, is intentionally performed by means of performance of another, which is the literal act. An indirect speech act is accomplished by implicatures, as in implying, from the word implying, as opposed to direct speech act that is accomplished by the literal meaning of the words that are spoken. Now, what makes an indirect speech successful? They must follow. They must they must fulfill these certain criteria. Number one, the preparatory conditions, the background, knowledge of hearer speaker, and the situation for which the speech act should be felicitous, should be true. Sincerity conditions, which is a necessary psychological state of the speaker and hearer. Number three, propositional content, the kind of situation or event. Essential conditions, the essence of the speech act, with what the act count as when the speaker performs an indirect speech. They state one of the felicity conditions apart from the essential conditions. Now, indirect speech acts within folktale bears profound significance, particularly in the employment of tricksters, but employment by tricksters and other competitors as strategic communicative tools to navigate complex social dynamics and achieve desired outcomes. These tricksters and other figures within folktales, they use their art of manipulative language to achieve their aims. They would deceive their rivals and they would overcome obstacles, which reflects their wit and very plainly say smartness, right? So within these tales, the two tales that I have selected for this paper, we'll see that the indirect language reflects broader societal expectations regarding communicative styles, social hierarchies, and interpersonal relationships. Moreover, the employment of indirect speech acts within folk narrative serves as a testament to the complexities of human interaction and the dynamic of power and control. Now, the second part of my paper, which is a supplementary method to the indirect speech act, is the language game theory, which is a deeply philosophical topic, actually. And And to confess, I just know the surface level of of this topic, but I have used its most basic meaning, and for this paper. Now, language game theory was propagated by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a philosopher, uh, and he donned many caps. He was philosopher, he was mathematician, he was a sociologist, etc. So it's a progression of his work from Tractatus, which was his earlier works, to philosophical investigations, which happened towards the later part of his career. And through this progression, he changed his view of language, which reflects a move away from logical atomism and positivism towards a more contextual and pragmatic approach to meaning. Now, the aim of the logical positivist, of which he was a part of in his earlier career, was to remove the ambiguity of language, to rely on logical conclusions that are arrived with mathematical precision, and they believe that language is used to visualize things. Now, he embarked on his evaluation of his earlier view of language as not being a process, but an ability. He posited that communication ensues when individuals establish a shared understanding of word and sentence usage. According to him, meaning can be encapsulated as, and I quote, the meaning of a word is how it is utilized in language. Now, these linguistic dynamics manifest in many forms, constituting what he terms as language games. Now, we do not learn language only through application of strict rules, and though we are taught grammar, we learn how to speak language through a plethora of life experiences. Next part of my presentation, very briefly, I have selected two tales from the Northeast, which is one from a Tangkul Naga folktale, the story of Kalhang, and an Assamese folktale, the story of Tenten. These can be found in these books that I've listed here. Tangkul Folk Literature by S. Ariganathan, and Folktales of Assam, which is a series of a folk tales series published by Sterling Publishers. Now, very briefly, this is the summary of the first story, Kalhang Langzar. You may read it right now, but I won't read out everything. It's about a man and a woman, Langzar from one village and Harkongla from a different village. Now, they are both competitors in animal rearing. One day, Langzar captures the buffalo that Harkongla owned, and he kills it and eats it. And when she comes looking for it, Langzar, insults her indirectly, as you would see, and and Harkongla also exacts her revenge. Now, at the same time, when this was happening, at the background, there were these tiger men. I think the characters of tiger men or men turning into animals is quite a common common character in so many folk tales and laws, in India, especially in the Northeast and around the world too, in indigenous folklore too. So they also have their own plans within this story. Now, after both animals from both sides have been killed and eaten, they come together to battle. Now, even though Langzar dies towards the end, his story, his bravery is still being commemorated. Now, the story of Tenten, again, story of a young man who is rather very clever and very witty. He uses his language, his language power, and it gets him into trouble. But at the same time, it also gets him out of trouble, and he uses certain language skills to manipulate everybody that he meets, and he ends up gaining much more than how he started with. He is kicked out from his family because he insulted his brother-in-law, and along he meets certain people with whom he engages, and he gets into trouble with them, and they all take him to the king. And but he through his language skill, he impresses everybody, and towards the end, he actually gets to marry the daughter of a very powerful magistrate, only because of his cleverness and his language skill, not because of any other merit that he might have. Again, for the brevity of the presentation, I've chosen only one line each from each story. Number one, from the story of Kalhang Langzar, "Come to my house and eat with me." Now, Langzar appears to make a request to Harkongla by way of invitation to dine with him, but his emotional or mental state performs the illocutionary force of insult. It is a double entendre sentence that satisfies the preparatory conditions of them being rivals from two villages who are competing in animal rearing. Langzar makes this utterance within the context that assumes that Harkongla will accede to his superiority. She obliges to his offer, even though he knows he is insulting her, and thus her act of entering his home satisfies the essential condition of performing an acceptance. These next three lines are from the story of Tenten. Now, these sentences are clearly metaphors, right? Father has gone to pierce the patal and make the earth upside down. She has taken 7 days old Painta and has gone to revive the dead. And
I'm
sister
so
has gone.
sorry. I would request you to sum up your presentation. Can you conclude?
Okay. So, okay, very briefly, George L. Hardy recognizes metaphors as indirect speech acts in terms of pragmatic meaning, in that it relies on the speaker's intention and the hearer's interpretation, rather than it's based on its grammatical or the semantics of these sentences. So I won't go through the whole thing. I've just though I you can read it for the purpose of the audience. Now, again, time constraints. I also wanted to talk about the language games here, but I don't think I would have time, and I did not write it in the PowerPoint because, again, time constraints. But as you can see here, the language games, the characters, they play with each other through the indirect speech acts. Even though there's tension, especially in the first story, there is tension throughout the tale, but they are careful to keep face, so as not to escalate or cross boundaries of politeness of which they are bound to. And throughout the tale, the characters try to outsmart each other through various language games of trickery, which is again the indirect speech act itself is the language game, right? They are engaged in the game of insult without directly making known to each other, or of their wishes. They do not speak to each other directly, insult them directly. And also in Tenten, he appears to be a master of trickster language, whereby he uses his prowess of speech and wit to win at every challenge, and in turn gets what he wants. Language games emphasizes the social and contextual dimension of language that is being used in these tales, illuminating the ways in which language shapes and in turn is shaped by the social world in which it is situated. In conclusion, in tales like these, the narratives of folktale can be analyzed through the role of language and how its many interpretations offer insight into the cultural world that they inhabit. And it is hoped that these tales can be put through rigorous, not only these two tales, but of course several other folk tales of the Northeast can be put through rigorous academic exercises that paves the way forward in which these folk tales can survive, not just as unique entertainment enjoyed by a few, but a larger contribution to the study of cultural discourse itself. When speaking about the limitations of the research of this scope, problems like interpretation and its limited locale within the larger discourse may come into consideration. The use of speech act theory and the supplementary use of language game theory may prove to be beneficial to narrative analysis. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sorinchon. Your paper was really wonderful, but I just have one question, if I can
Yes.
ask it here.
Yes.
And maybe others will also have questions, but they can post it in the text box, chat box, whatever it is. So, okay. So I wanted to ask you, how are you interpreting Wittgenstein's theory here, and how are you using that as a method? And also how do you think ambiguity plays a very important part in these indirect speech acts in folktales especially? That is my question. You can think about it, answer later also. It's not it's not an urgent question, but it was going on in my mind because we had very less time to talk about Wittgenstein's theory here.
Yes.
Therefore, please just put light on this a little bit.
So yeah, when I looked into Wittgenstein's language game theory, I do realize that it is actually a very it's high philosophy, and unfortunately, as students of literature, we are not trained to to read and study. But what I have done is I have I have used its very basic meaning of language games. Of when we speak to each other, we kind of play games with each other, right? Every day when we talk to each other, we play language games with each other. And when it comes to these folk tales, again with the problem of it being you said something with it being. Can you just repeat that question about it being?
I asked about the ambiguity.
Ambiguity, yes. That's a problem, ambiguity, because when we interpret there, I mostly rely on it being purely textual. For example, if I talk about it on a larger social scale, or on its cultural background, it's actually very problematic, because we do not have too many not much of primary sources. For example, I would say, especially for like work from the Northeast, where many of these folk tales are are oral in nature, right? And they're only published and translated sometimes by, I don't know if the term outsider would be incorrect, but translated by people who do not actually write the language, and they do not provide subtext, or they do not provide meaning or context through it. So I just am relying on me analyzing it textually within the tale itself. If Did I answer your question?
Yes. You can think about it. It's not I'm not asking it out of. I was just curious about this, how you are applying this theory here.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It was a wonderful presentation, and we hope that the work from Northeast and work from all other communities, tribal communities, marginalized communities, and work on folklore as such, we are able to do it properly, because mostly what happens is there is a loss that happens because we try to interpret it in our own ways. So thank you, Sorinchon. We will go to the next presenter now.
Thank you.
Anybody else, if they have questions, they can post it, I think, in the chat box, right? If I'm right, Bhumika?
Yes, ma'am. And we can take up the questions later on, once all the presentations.
Okay. So please, if you have any questions, you can post it there. So we'll go to the next presenter. I think two people are there: Florence Laldinpuii and Haidamteu Zeme. They are doctoral scholars and a teaching assistant from Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. And the topic of their presentation is Myth or Folktale: Politics and Problematics of Translating Indigenous Oral Narratives. Are you there? Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Please continue.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. I'll start. So a very good evening, everyone. The title of our presentation is Myths or Folktale, Politics and Problematics of Translating Indigenous Oral Narratives. And I would like to mention that this is based on a collaborative work with my fellow research scholar, Haidamteu Zeme. And we started with this very question, myth or folktale, because we wanted to urge scholars, especially translators of folklore studies, to pause and actually take a step back from ignorantly publishing studying collections without being cognizant of the politics of language and also the internal politics within the very field of folkloristics, such as the dominance of Western and European theories and models of folklore. As a result of the hegemony of non-BIPOC epistemologists, there is a tendency to sideline various oral narratives and indigenous articulations. So this paper aims to illuminate the nuances and the ambiguities surrounding classifications such as myths, folk tales, fairy tales, legends, and so on. Since these nuances are expressed by translators of folklore, we look at contemporary translations and publications in English coming from the Northeast region. So this is a brief outline of our paper, where we begin with a literature review and we look at some of the problems in theories and the classifications in the field of folkloristics. And secondly, we look at definitions, conceptions in the Northeast with reference to the Mizo and Naga communities. And thirdly, we take some examples of oral narratives. Here we take the example of a Mizo narrative of Tura, where we look at the arguments against Tura's account being a tanzin or a story or a tontu. Fourthly, we dwell on the role or the function of the translator, where we look at some of the challenges faced by the translator. And we end our paper with some concluding remarks and also suggest a way forward in this study. So when it comes to identifying and classifying folk materials, especially oral narratives and indigenous articulations, the question one often comes across is that how do you sift and sieve and select which ones to publish? So what, for instance, distinguishes fairy tales from folk tales? So we look at some of the criticisms and arguments which have been posed by various major critics of folklore studies. Distinctions beginning with terminologies of folklore and folkloristics have been explored.
I'm so
Yes.
sorry to prompt you, but your presentation is not moving.
Okay, is it on the morphology of folktale
It's
challenges?
it's on the first screen. You can remove it from the slideshow. You can click on the slides and then you can. Yeah, now it's
Okay.
fine. That's fine.
All right. Is it on challenges in folkloristics? Hello?
Yeah, it's on
Oh.
challenges.
So, Alan Dundas, for instance, argued that folklore is associated with materials, whereas folkloristics refers to the theoretical study of folklore. And Vladimir Prop, in Morphology of the Folktale, also pondered upon the problem of classification, especially of classifying folk materials. And he argued on how different classes or genres are actually intermingled in a tale. Prop therefore expresses that it is very difficult to arrive at a definite definition of a fairy tale, and he further calls for a detailed comparative study in this field. For Campbell, on the other hand, the difference between a myth and a fairy tale is that the hero of the fairy tale achieves a macrocosmic triumph, and the hero of a myth achieves a fairy tale achieves microcosmic and the hero of a myth achieves a macrocosmic triumph. But then again, like all these assumptions also assume a hierarchy where myths are placed above that of fairy tales. So the question we then are confronted with is, are scholars working on South Asian folklore then to blindly conform to such standards set by Western and European folklorists? So I'm moving on to the next slide. I hope you can see it. So in asking all these type of questions, we turn towards the Northeast for study, where we look specifically at Mizo and Naga lores. And the reason for this turn is because there is a growth of interest and circulation of the tribal lores and the oral narratives, which further intimate wider readership. Secondly, more scholars and academics embark on translation projects, and we find that there is a growth of translators and publications from within the region. And thirdly, there is all this increase in the number of publications also adversely widen the gap in theory and methodology, because compared to the task of translating, there is a lack of attempts at theorizing, and even the translators' challenges are often left unaddressed. So We also think that the intervention of the script in such an oral culture signifies colonial encounters and evangelizing mission, and all these could further contribute to arguments on the politics of orality and textuality. So when it comes to Mizo folklore, scholars argue that Mizo folktales first appeared in print in 1874 when Captain Thomas Herbert Lewin, who was the then Deputy Commissioner of Chittagong Hills of pre-colonial India, or British India, and T.H. Lewin published this book, Progressive Colloquial Exercises in the Lushai Dialect. So this book included 3 Mizo narratives, but these narratives were not referred to as folktales, but instead they were referred to as stories.
Florence, so sorry to interrupt you again. The slides are not moving.
It's all right. It's all right. So maybe I should.
It's moving now. Yeah.
I think I will open my PDF instead.
Yeah, sure.
Oh no, sorry. So in case there is malfunction with the slide, you can just refer to this.
Should I present? I have saved your.
It's all right. So you can see it clearly, right?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, okay. I hope this will do. So in this book, which was argued to be the first publication of Mizo folktales in English, the book included 3 stories, but these were not referred to as folktales back then. And moreover, this book was, designed to assist the British administrators in their administration over the hills. So here then the addressee, or the one who is being addressed, is that of the white man, who also plays a political function in the publication of these tales. So one of the earliest known compilation and publication coming from Mizo, or from within the Mizo community, is that of P.S. Daroka's Mizo Tontu. And the book on its very title page also suggests that, there is a distinction between legends and folktales by writing that this book is Legends and Folktales of the Mizo People, compiled and edited by P.S. Daroka. So when it comes to problems of classification, we have selected this particular tale on the narrative of Tura or Turbura from Mizo narrative. And it is one of the more contested narratives where a prominent figure appears in the narrative. And he goes by the name of Turbura, also referred to as Tura for short. And the many stories of Tura have been identified, translated, and published by several scholars as quote-unquote folktales. And some of these examples include Laltuang Liana Kyangte's title Tura, Undisputed Hero of Mizo Folktales, in the collection Mizo Songs and Folktales, which was published in 2018. And the other example includes Margaret Elpatsuao's publication on Tura titled The Adventures of Tura, which she included in her collection Folklore from Mizoram, published in 2013. But when it comes to Tura, all these narratives surrounding him are seldom identified as tontu or stories. Instead, if we look at the Mizo publications, they are often referred to as Tsantin, which has a closer equivalent or connotation to historical or biographical accounts or information. So this inclination to call it, an account is driven by the belief in Tura's existence in history, and it indirectly marks a negation of the unrealistic or imaginative construct counterpart of folklore. Furthermore, we also see that several Mizo-cultural historians also mention the history of Tura with very poignant details, including his tribe, his ethnicity, his village, and so on. And what interestingly further supplements such a narrative is the prevalence of a group identifying as the descendants of Tura or Tura-Tlate to date. So today we have numerous translations and publications on Mizo and Naga lores, but there is an imbalance between the growth of the translation and publication and that of theorization and methodology, especially concerning such indigenous articulations. Several publications only lead to more ambiguities, especially around the concept of folklore. For instance, in Laltuang Lianakyangte's Folktales of Mizoram. The book is divided into 5 sections with a section on quote-unquote memoir. So the inclusion of male memoirs, which are real-life accounts of people, in the same platform as accounts of Mizo folk heroes or folk tales, highlights the lucidity of borders in history and story. Secondly, we also find in Changte's or Cherila Nunziri Changte's publication, The Bluff Book of Mizo Myths, where we find some narratives which are published as myths, but which are elsewhere published as folk tales by other cultural historians and translators. So we are confronted with this question: are myths and folk tales then interchangeable in the indigenous context? According to one critic, Margaret L. Patswal, the word myth can refer to any traditional story, and this distinction between myth, legend, and folktale is simply meant as a tool for grouping them. But we would like to argue that one might read this instead as a launching pad for conceptualizing myth. And we further argue that one of the challenges is the very absence of the Mizo equivalent for folktale. Similarly, there is no English equivalent for several oral narratives or categories. One common example that we often come across in tribal communities, especially with respect to the Northeast region, is that of the war cry, which has, as we all know, like distinct intonations, rhythms, lyrics, and so on, and further represents an indigenous articulation carrying cultural memory. So all these imbalances are further affected by various factors like colonialism, the imposition of a script, translation, and so on. And colonialism and Christianity, as we all know, brought about consistent negation of myths, folk, and cultural lore through the sanitization, censorship, and demystification project. And they also further bring about the rewriting of identity politics in the region. When we look at the role of the translator, we also see that a translator is faced with a lot of challenges. Heimendorf, for instance, expressed that the recording and translation of the innumerable languages of the Tibeto-Burman group has a complicated tonal system. No outsider has ever learned any of the many Konyak dialects, and even the Nagas of neighboring tribes comment on the great differences between these idioms and their own languages. Translator and literary theorist Tejaswini Niranjana further offers a critical take on the importance of studying the gaps in translation studies by saying, translation does not make any claim to solve the dilemmas of translators. It does not propose a more foolproof method of narrowing the gap between cultures. It seeks rather to think through this gap, this difference, to explore the positioning of the obsessions and desires of translation, and thus describe the economies within which the sign of translation circulates. Therefore, we should ask ourselves, what role does the politics of language play in the classifications of folk materials? Theorizations within folklore studies borrow from specific Western ontological beginnings. For example, we know that the term fairy tale was also an influence of the Russian folklorist Vladimir Prop, who uses the term skaza. So there is a risk of westernizing indigenous knowledges because of the tendency of translation to deviate from the source community's political, cultural, and linguistic context. This study invites scholars to, recalling Tejaswini's remark, think through the gaps within folkloristics. It begins with contesting the assumptions of peoples or folk in a universalizing sense, and secondly, on the problem of translation as the problem of language. A critical analysis of selected narratives from Mizo and Naga communities further reveal the nuances in the socio-cultural and theoretical underpinnings of folklore, especially among indigenous communities rooted in oral traditions. So, where do we go from here? So in dwelling on this question, we would like to make a few suggestions and for the way forward in folklore studies. And firstly, we suggest that we can start by attempting an interpretation of the various classes, forms, and genres of indigenous articulations. And secondly, scholars should also consciously deliberate on loaded neologisms such as myth, folk tales, fairy tales, legends, and so on. And thirdly, the theoretical and methodological gaps in the field of folkloristics concerning South Asian studies should be confronted and explored with more inclusivity. We should rather ask ourselves all these challenging questions and dwell upon them. And some of these questions that we would like to pose forward is, firstly, what role does the politics of language play in the classifications of folk materials? Secondly, what occupies the place of fairy tales in indigenous oral narratives? And thirdly, what relevance do voices or tellings from these spaces carry, especially when economies have developed into booming capitalistic enterprises? To conclude, this study reveals the difficulty of arriving at a definite or fixed definition and identification of folk materials, especially when all these conceptions are rooted in non-BIPOC epistemologies. This study also reflects the urgency to engage in an interpretation of the various classes, forms, and genres of indigenous articulations. It marks a call for the sensitization of the ethical repercussions of translating, hence also reproducing narratives in the name of scholarship. So we would like to also end with this argument that one should not translate for translation's sake, nor should one publish for publication's sake, especially if these are driven by capital and commercial interests. Instead, scholars of folklore must confront the theoretical and methodological gaps in the field of folkloristics concerning indigenous narratives and concerning South Asian studies at large. Thank you very much. These are some of the works.
Thank you, Florence. Your paper was very it was a very insightful paper, and it was a very good presentation because it's an interesting area that we are currently. It's a very big problem that we face when we translate oral narratives from various regions. So I think if I have a little bit of time, then I will ask a question. Otherwise, people can ask their questions in the chat box. I will also put my question in the chat box. Bhumika, can you please tell me if I can?
So, ma'am, we can have your final remarks and questions once the two presentations are done.
Okay. Thank you, Florence. We will go to the next presenter then. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. We'll go to the next presenter. Rimai Jose, Assistant Professor, Dr. BMN College of Home Science, Autonomous, Matunga, Mumbai. Her topic for presentation today is Fairy Tales as a Pedagogical Tool for Critical Analysis in Slow Learners. Are you there?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
continue.
Camera. Yeah. Okay. So good evening, everybody. My presentation concerns a paper that we've introduced in our institution this academic year in Dr. BMN College of Home Science, which offers courses like nutrition, food science, textiles, basically a home science, pure science background. So this is the first batch of science undergraduate students who have been asked to attempt this paper, choose this paper, and it incorporates fairy tales as a pedagogical tool for critical thinking under foundational subjects to provide a multidisciplinary approach to the curriculum. Okay, so as we understand, folklore encompasses a wide range of traditional stories, customs, and beliefs passed down orally through generations within a culture or community. And at the same time, fairy tales, with their magical elements and moral lessons, are a subset of this larger body of folklore. While often associated with children's literature, fairy tales do have a significant place in literature. And feminist retellings of fairy tales often interpret traditional stories to challenge gender stereotypes, empower female characters, and explore themes of agency and equality. So these retellings give voice to probably previously marginalized characters, or they offer alternate perspectives or subvert traditional narratives, and they promote feminist ideals. So with the introduction of this paper, we aimed to engage these first-year undergraduates who've come from a pure science background in critical thinking and analyzing tales, traditional popular fairy tales, enabling them to understand the rationale behind character decisions taken by the author and how social norms probably form their collective consciousness. And therefore, the aim to introduce this paper was twofold. That is, one, to get the learners to read. And for this, we had to offer them something which they would be able to read with ease, which a simpler language, which would enable them to read the text. And it is really difficult to get learners to read nowadays, whether it's a textbook or a storybook. So secondly, the learners should be able to articulate and respond to what they have read. So till last year, the Institute ran a paper in English, including short stories, novels, poems for everybody in the first year. However, we noticed that this does not work very well for the students who are probably not from English medium schools or found critical thinking tough as it is when English is not your first language. And under the NEP 2020, there was an opportunity as a college is autonomous to create an optional paper for these slow learners who needed simple narratives to follow and not the stories that we were doing for the intermediate class. And that's how we were able to introduce the paper Language Through Literature. And it is a separate paper designed for gradually paced learners who find the intermediate paper too much too quick. And in the initial stages, the team of teachers focused on children's literature with less text and illustrations so that the students in the classroom from vernacular mediums would be able to follow the text. However, this would have defeated the aim of getting students to read more effectively if we had chosen those books. So the current draft of the syllabus includes simple narratives from Ruskin Bond, Sudha Murthy in the first module, and the second module focuses on retelling of fairy tales and its retellings from a contemporary point of view. So in this module, this is our first batch. So what we've initially done is we've begun by first screening a video of the traditional fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood, and then discussing in the classroom the variations between the film and two retellings, which were not prescribed but chosen during this semester, one by Sarah Blakely Cartwright and one by Angela Carter, which have very different versions of the traditional fairy tale. And similarly, we discussed the fairy tale The Beauty and the Beast. It's retelling by Angela Carter. And another one which the students were familiar with was The Little Mermaid, which is a literary fairy tale. And we screened the film adaptation for the students and the new one, the one that came out recently. And we discussed the themes in the film and mostly about female agency in the film. So now speaking about how it's a tool for critical thinking, fairy tales can easily be used as a pedagogical tool. Interest is generated and maintained due to the easy introduction of characters, the easy flow of scenes, and literary terms such as themes, novels, short stories, epics, plots, point of view can be explained in class using the fairy tale as a model. And the students can be encouraged to compare the conventions of the genre to those of the other literary genres. The plot construction, the characterization of these retellings can be compared to those of traditional fairy tales. Students were also taught to discover literary devices that enrich their reading of the text, whether the writer has employed any formulas, how it evokes the atmosphere in the fairy tale, how it makes the reader feel, and whether it enhances their knowledge of history or geography or any political conditions in that region. And the text, so it can also be utilized to teach them about ethical reasoning and decision making, because it frequently features moral conundrums. And probing questions were used to introduce topics of gender and culture to the class. And the focus of the curriculum was on reading, critical thinking, gender sensitivity, and language acquisition. And the potential for stimulating class discussions and critical analysis increased with further exploration of each text that we did. Overall, it can be an effective educational tool for gaining a variety of knowledge and skills. So post sessions, what evaluation, we gave them a few options that they can choose. It's to write an essay on the themes of any fairy tale, a story writing where they have to pick an Indian fairy tale from their childhood or from somewhere they've heard, and change the ending, and preferably if it has a female protagonist. The third option was a role play with improvised scene. So if they agree with the actions of the character in the scene, if they do not, then how would they change that scene? And posters describing the themes. For story writing, we gave them the option of Indian fairy tales, and we were working with the assumption that since they are from semi-English or non-English medium schools, they would be comfortable picking a story from their regional languages. But unfortunately, what we saw is that the students were unfamiliar with Indian fables and fairy tales, and when asked to write assignments on the same, we realized that they are not only unfamiliar to them, they also lacked an interest in researching Indian fairy tales, as they are not, in their words, highly popularized in media as the Western ones. So very few students looked for an Indian fairy tale to create a retelling or identify themes for an essay. And for example, many students chose to improvise the stories of Cinderella, Snow White, Thumbelina, and giving those female characters agency in their versions, which they did very well. But based on that analysis, since it's the first semester we've run this paper, at the end, based on that analysis, the paper plans to now add select Indian fairy tales to the prescribed reading list, and it will be accompanied probably by a screening of adaptations or mini series available to familiarize the students with Indian folklore. And even though the primary objective of the paper initially was to generate interest in reading through fairy tales, just reading, but it has now expanded its scope to include Indian fairy tales and fable from various regions in India, which we are hoping will help students become familiar with one's culture and existing Indian folklore, possibilities for exploration. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima. It was a wonderful, very interesting way of introducing folk tales and folk narratives within the classroom, because it's a very big problem that we face in class every day, because people, they know all the English writers and all the people, others, and they don't know their own, back home, they don't know anything about what is happening. So I think it's a first session or first time that you have introduced
First
this.
semester, yes.
Yes, first semester. So I just hope very beautiful things come out of this course in the future. There will be questions, so they can post it in the. I will also have my question in the chat box. But we'll go to the next presentation now. Thank you, Rima. We'll go to the next presenter. Yonshu Choi, she is from Seoul National University. The The topic for presentation is Transformation of the Simcheong Narrative, Korean Gramophone Drama, Modern Simcheong Jeon. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing them wrong. Please let me know because I don't know the language and I'm not very good in this. So, yes, Yanshu, please continue with your presentation.
I hope this is visible. Is this?
Yeah, it's visible.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and am I audible to everyone as well?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah.
You're audible.
Okay. Thank you for introducing me first of all, and you pronounced my name correctly. And I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for the conference and all of the participants, presenters as well. It's my pleasure to be here. And okay, so I'm going to deliver my presentation, and I'm going to talk about transformation of the Simcheong narrative, Korean gramophone drama, which is called modern Simcheongjeon. Pansori is traditional performing art that originated in the 18th century, in which the singer conveys narrative through songs and dramatic gestures. In the 1930s, with the introduction of new medium of the gramophone, traditional Pansori narratives such as Simcheong were recorded. This process resulted in a transformation of Pansori into plays, and giving rise to a genre known as gramophone dramas. Since standard play records were commercial products, they were highly sensitive to the taste of the consumer public. Modern Simcheongjeon is a great example to help us to identify how traditional narratives were received and transmitted in the 1930s. Korea was under colonial period, so when Japanese rule was oppressive, indirect forms of expression such as satire were frequently attempted and employed. In particular, in the 1930s, when freedom of expression was controlled, the development of satirical literature accelerated. Accordingly, the modern Simcheongjeon creates its comic sense through the depiction of the socio-cultural context prevalent at the time. And before delving into the work, it's crucial to consider the medium and the physical properties of the SP record. Recording time was limited, allowing only about 5 to 6 minutes of content on a single record. This medium is exclusively auditory, relying on sound elements for communication. Therefore, due to its commercial nature, the remediation of Pansori into the format of an SP record is essentially a strategic reproduction aimed at capturing the contemporary audience interest and aligning with the social cultural context of the time. If the goal were simply to convey the entire narrative, it would have sufficed to narrate it without remediating it into the stylized form of a play. Consequently, contemporaneousness profoundly influences how gramophone dramas based on the Simcheong narrative embody the primary sense of beauty in the work. And normally, the core actions of the Simcheong narrative can be divided into these 4 sections. In short, the most important event is that the blind man Sim's filial daughter Simcheong sells herself to seafaring merchants as a sacrificial offering in the Indang Sea in exchange for 300 sacks of rice to be delivered to the temple. In the end, Simcheong is revived and becomes an empress, and her father regains his sight. So to summarize, the main lesson of this narrative is about filial piety. On the other hand, since the modern Simcheongjeon is set in the 1930s, Sim is transformed into a teacher at a school for the blind, and his daughter Simcheong becomes a female worker in a rubber factory. Sim worries when Simcheong fails to return from the factory, so while passing over the Gwangyo stream, on the way to the tram road to meet Simcheong, he falls into the water in surprise at a bicycle. In this work, instead of the monk, the doctor from Daejungwon, a modern hospital, bandages his head and treats the injured part. Later, after returning from the hospital, Sim informs Simchang and Bangduk's mother that the doctor told me if you give me 300 won for treatment, I can regain my sight. With this transformation of the background, the comic sense of this work is created through the character's perception of the confusing social conditions. I'd like to examine the section that forms the comic sense through the representation of the time. First, paragraph A is about Bangduk's mother's statements. We don't have enough money for 300 won reflects her disdain for Sim's foolishness. She's the one who approached Sim for his fortune in the original narrative, but this time her statement serves as a comical sense aimed at highlighting Sim's ridiculousness and enlightening him. Bangduk's mother's satirical remarks towards him stem from his incomprehension of the new culture, particularly the capitalist modern economy. His lack of economic sense under this system contrasts with his role as an economic agent, revealing a fundamental misunderstanding of the logic of capitalism. Secondly, Sim's ignorance is contrasted with Bangduk's mother's critique of materialism and creating irony. In her utterance, she criticized the prevailing memonism of the time, highlighting the gap in the understanding of the modern era for each figure. However, despite Sim's incomprehension, he also demonstrates a critical perception of the chaotic times. This suggests a complex portrayal of his character. The paragraph B is Sim's response immediately following Bangduk's mother's utterance. In contrast to his earlier desire to regain his sight, Sim now expresses contentment with his blindness, stating that he doesn't need to see a word that he finds unbearable to hear. This divergence from his previous longing to regain sight highlights his heightened awareness of the absurdity of the present world. He even adds, seeing the world as it is now, being blind, is a blessing. This symbolizes his deliberate avoidance of the bright world, emphasizing the troubled times in which he lives. As revealed in these two paragraphs A and B, the 1930s in Korea were characterized by political lethargy after the loss of national sovereignty and the failure of the independence movement. Indulgence in modern consumption culture reflects an economic insufficiency in Korea's colonial context. In short, it was a time when Korea's colonial contradictions reached their peak, both materially and spiritually. Thirdly, as demonstrated in paragraph C, during the discourse with Simchang, the blind man Sim employs words with similar pronunciations in succession to create language play and induce laughter. This contributes to the aesthetics of comics as well. Unlike the original narrative of Simchang, who went to Indangsi, she is being sold to Harbin stencil this time. So Harbin is the city of China, as you know, and Sim is about to bid farewell to Simchang, but he continues to make a joke around by saying, then will it take a day by the railroad tracks? And in Korean, a day is pronounced like haru, so it's kind of similar with Harbin. So then Sim asks, if it takes 2 days, how could you call it Harubin, which indicates Harbin? And it's a pun using words with similar pronunciations. In addition, he understands Dansol as 단사흘, which indicates only 3 days in Korean. The Dansol is related to the introduction of modern entertainment culture. It was a very commercially popular urban entertainment place in large cities during the early 20th century. The aesthetic sense of the comic that results from this wordplay diminishes the sorrow of farewell and reinforces the irony of situation the two father and daughter are in. On the other hand, Sim responds to what Simchong called a waitress by using the phrase, "How could I hear that you were dirty?" It sounds like 외도롭소 in Korean. So again, 외도롭소 and waitress, this kind of sounds similar as well. So this is a language play that uses words with similar pronunciation just as earlier. However, Sim is different from the previous instance in that he understood that the word waitress meant. This understanding is indicated by his response, "You were dirty." Sim's response is also closely related to the atmosphere of the time, because waitress refers to a female worker who provides services in cafes. The cafe was a place for entertainment introduced from Japan in the early modern period, but it also functioned as a place for sexual interaction with customers at times. Phrases such as, "I didn't realize that you could change like this," become evidence. As a result, this expression can be seen as having a dual function within the narrative, as Sim continues his verbal mischief, but on the other hand, he blames Simchong. In short, Sim demands that even in the practice of filial piety, it is done in a way that does not harm the practice of chastity. This aspect of Sim needs to be illuminated in the context of the time. In this way, it can be seen that the conflict between the Confucian values of filial piety and chastity is represented through Simchong living for the dance hall in modern Simcheongjeon. In fact, the situation faced by Simchong is not much different from the situation of Koreans under colonial rule in the 1930s. When the Simchong narrative appeared, filial piety was established as the dominant ideology of Korean society. Even Japanese imperialism focused on Confucianism, traditionally emphasized by Koreans, to strengthen the Japanese government general system and to mitigate Koreans' antipathy toward their forced occupation. In short, from the Joseon dynasty to the modern era, filial piety has established a strong Confucian value system that maintains society as a ruling ideology. Based on this understanding, it is significant that there is a conflict between Sim and Simchong, who decide to go to a dance hall. Sim begins to show antipathy towards Simchong's decision because she says others work as waitress to support their parents or siblings, so what's wrong with working at a dance hall? And Sim says, "I didn't realize that you could change like this." However, there is a seemingly contradictory aspect to Sim's reluctance. This is because, in fact, Simchang in the original narrative does not differ contextually in her willingness to sell her body to pay for her father's eye-opening. Consequently, through Sim's response, we can infer that there was a negative perception of the dance hall. Despite its popularity as a form of entertainment, dance halls naturally became associated with eroticism, contributing to a prevailing view of them as venues with an immoral atmosphere. On the other hand, waitress, which Simchang referred to in comparison with dance hall, was a term indicating women who provided services at cafes. At that time, cafes were characterized as entertainment venues and also served as spaces where people could experience the modern era, such as listening to popular music on gramophone. However, considering the income structure of waitress at the time, they were positioned within a hierarchical order that required them to satisfy the sexual desires of male customers to earn money. In particular, the cafe was, in some senses, regarded as a type of brothel due to the presence of illicit prostitution. Given this, Sim's remarks, which express shock at Simchong for having changed, can be equated with the gaze that society in general had on waitress at that time. Unlike the original narrative in this work, Simchang is considered to have no chastity because she lives for the dance hall. The social implication included here is the women must keep filial piety and chastity together. To get his father's eye-opening and 301 for him, Simchang in the 1930s was in a situation in which the Confucian values of filial piety and chastity were bound to conflict. In fact, during the colonial period, many women entered the labor market due to the economic incompetence of the head of the household or the poverty of the family. Additionally, there was a significant increase in women's sexual labor and incidents of human trafficking. The emergence of conflicting, Confucian values, previously seen as unwavering, underscores the turmoil of the era. So in short, modern Simcheongjeon reflects the chaotic social reality of Korea under colonial rule in the 1930s, revealing its historical characteristics. So this is all, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. I think this is a very important presentation because we know how representation and how the idea of representation is one of the most important things when we are talking about the mass media and how the recent publications or recent presentations or drama or anything that represents the folk narratives or the narratives which have been already present there in the society at a certain time. So I think the historical point is something you have raised very wonderfully. Thank you so much. With this, I think all the presentations for this session are over. Okay. If anybody has any questions, they can type it in the chat box, and all of you who are there, you can answer it in your own time. But I would just want to ask one or two questions at this point, because it was a very interesting session, because such insightful things from all over the world, if I may say so. So okay, so the first question that I have is for the second presentation, because it was a presentation, I think, by Florence, and they have talked about translation and the problems of translation. What do you think is the actual, what do you think, where do you place untranslatability in this context? Because when we say that there is a hegemony in translation, and there are we are always imbibing the methods of, or we are trying to, follow the methods which are presented by the Western scholars, and the South Asian perspective is not represented properly. Where do you place untranslatability? Untranslatability will also be a Western theory, which we would be implying, which would be applying to the folk tales here. So are you talking about translation? Translating, but not translating. You have the ethics, of course. The ethics of translation is always there, but where do you place untranslatability here? Are you there? I don't think if
Yes,
he's there.
I'm here. Yeah. So
Okay.
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mekla, for that question. And it's very true. Like, it's also very difficult to try to locate, the untranslatability in such, oral narratives. Especially, I think this is owing to the absence of a script or a standard script, and we all know that script also script comes like with the intervention of colonialism, right? So, and when it comes to translation, I would like to call upon my fellow scholar Haidam to also talk more on it, because she's the one whose expertise actually lies in that area. So Haidam.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you. The question of untranslatable, of course, it's a very necessary question when it comes to translation and the methodologies that kind of figure in it. I think, yeah, definitely the concept, a lot of other exponents of that, I think Emily Apter or Barbara Kassan, especially with their dictionary of untranslatables, they bring in a lot of like Eurocentric words, and the concept also arrives from that sort of space. But I think as a translation theorists or people who are interested in translation, scholars such as us studying translation, we can kind of draw from their concepts, just as in a way of like referring to a specific sort of methodology. But it's very crucial that we add our own sort of interpretation to these very largely westernized concepts. I draw a lot of inspiration, even our paper draws a lot of inspiration from like Caribbean authors too. We also kind of, it's the paper of course is limited in the presentation, but in a larger work we will kind of look at Edward Glissant or Jamaica Kincaid, where they talk about the right to opacity for very minoritized communities. We're always kind of asked to explain ourselves, like translate this, what is the meaning behind this? And sometimes it's difficult to find equivalents in English. I think one large question when we are doing translation, it's like the language of speech. Like we're talking right now, it's primarily in English, and all of us are not native English speakers. So when we are translating from one specific medium to another, and especially when that medium, which is the source language, which is like Zeme or Mizo, or it could be Thankul, Pumai, or any of these Naga communities or communities that do not have a script as such, when we move meanings, into a written sort of medium, which is in English, so there is a local sort of global sort of passage. So the question of untranslatable comes in it, but I think we have to look at untranslatable as a kind of portal or an entry point to kind of understanding the idiosyncrasies of a specific culture that we are studying. So that can become an unraveling point. So it's not like untranslatable is not translatable in that sense, but it can lead to further explorations about the question of translation itself. Yeah.
So can I just add that the way forward from here onwards, we would like to suggest, and this talk is also like ongoing with some that we've known, is to also try to come up with a form of documenting these oral narratives, like instead of just translating them or textualizing them. So we need to come up with a way of documenting these oral narratives, recording them, like especially the sonorous and the oral aspects of it. And also we also need to come up with frameworks and ways of referencing or citing these type of sources. So yeah.
Thank you to both of you for answering the question. Your questions, others who have questions, they will put it in the chat box. You can answer it. I would not ask many more questions because I think we have run out of time. But thank you to the presenters. It was a very interesting session. All the papers were very insightful, very new, and a lot of recent work which we have been seeing from the Northeast and from oral, folk tales and oral narratives. You have started the work, and you have explained to us the methodologies you have used in your work and how we can further study about these things. Thank you so much to the presenters, and also there are some questions that we already have about translation, about representation, about the politics of translation, about the ethics of translation, and a lot of other things that folk tales and how we translate them and how we represent them when we are studying as outsiders or not studying from, we are not from the same regions that we are studying cultures which are not, other cultures. When we are studying how we are trying to represent them and how the loss that happens between these two cultures, all these questions have been raised, and it is for us to further work on them and do further research. But thank you so much to the presenters today. I hope you will do better work, a lot of good work in the future. And thank you to Bhumika and Meghal and Mir, the coordinators. Thank you so much for inviting me as a chair. And I hope I have not wasted a lot of time at the end.
You've not wasted any time at all. Thank you so much for chairing this session and for all your lovely insights. I just hope we could take up all the questions and things that could lead up for a good discussion. But I think that is something for a later. We could have multiple sessions and this can keep on going and going. Thank you to all the paper presenters. And the one thing that I found out through all the papers was the consistency and the willingness to explore stories and narratives. that is the constant thing, and I think that has to be kept alive, because even as young adults, I think we're still kids. We're still trying to understand stories. We've heard our grandparents, our fathers, our parents, everyone uh, telling us stories, and we didn't get the meaning. But now we are sort of trying to understand it in a very nuanced and critical manner. But at the same time, it's important to have that fun, and also to keep on building up that interest for others as well. So I'm so happy that everyone was able to share that.
I would also like to add something to this, because there is a lot of unlearning that will happen as we move forward through our learning. I mean, listening to the same stories that we have heard when we were kids. So, yes, this unlearning is the process that we should go through in order to do good research, or in order to, I mean, do proper work on the areas that we are embarking on. So, yes, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
We would and this was the last paper session for the day and for the conference. So I think this was a lovely way to wrap it up in the sense, and this kind of gives us the like insight that it's still not over. There is so much yet to be studied and understood, and to explore. Now I would like to like, is me there? Can we start with the next?
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Bhumika and Meghal. Thank you, Mekladi. And this session has been so diverse, so rich, many perspective, questioning the theoretical framework, and pedagogy also involved in there, and regions like somebody also joined from a different part of the world. So it was a really rich session. I thank you, all of you, the audience also. Now we will move to the valedictory session, but before that I will take charge and uh, just make sure a few things. Please stop the recording.